that your eyes and ears are hearing me. Now you've got me. Now you've got me. And I bet you are hearing me now. You're hearing me now. Fantastic. So let's try to focus only a tiny bit on Zelensky's meeting with Trump and the global ramifications of that. We've done a few personal live Q&As. This is going to be more political and more analytical. I'll try to answer other questions about what's happening in the world too, as best I can. But what is our tradition, beautiful community? It's to scroll upwards and honor people at the bottom. Now, I'm very insecure, as you know. My confidence is just extremely low, have very low self-esteem, which means I just need one more reassurance from you that you're actually hearing me, because this silly microphone has been playing up. Just a little bit more reassurance so that my self-esteem can go up. My self-esteem is going up really, really high. It's pretty much now, my ego is now the size of an aircraft hangar. So we can begin. Fish say thanks. I'm going to try to not take half an hour over this, beautiful community. Sometimes I get so stuck in the questions that have been left behind, that have been left early on. But we will do this a bit more quickly this time. So, Vlad, do you think it was correct of Mr. Zelensky to focus on Tomahawks in the meeting with Trump? So there is an eviscerating piece in the Financial Times today, which says that Trump claims that Trump shouted at Zelensky, that Trump said that Putin would destroy Ukraine if Zelensky didn't make more concessions. And essentially, the meeting went very, very badly. It wasn't a surprise, but it went very, very badly. And Trump, in the wrong language of commentators, reverted back to a more pro-Russian vantage point. It's very important that we ask journalists to eliminate out of their language, to a degree of 90%, terms like Trump's done a U-turn or Trump's changed his mind. Trump has fleeting dispositional states which come and go against the background of course, some structural forces forcing him into a enemy foe relation with Russia, but also a couple of very important structural forces, his narcissism and his ideological affinity with Putin, pushing him together with Putin. So we want to get rid of this language of U-turn and changes of mind. I don't change my mind if I say something today and I say the opposite tomorrow and I say it again the day after. These are just fleeting dispositional states. Changes of mind are presuppose an underlying belief with a degree of steadiness. Trump rarely has that. He has a few beliefs like that. For instance, his famous beliefs about tariffs. But these beliefs are very few, and they're very fixed indeed. So the few beliefs he has, he'll never change his mind on, and much of the rest is just fleeting dispositional states. Another wrong language is weakness. Trump is not showing weakness with Putin as much as he's showing realignment. Okay, having ranted a bit, let's look at Fish says thanks again. Do you think it was correct for Zelensky to focus on the Tomahawks in the meeting with Trump? I feel like if he focused on smaller and more systemic things, he might have gotten something out of it. I doubt he could have got much more out of this meeting with Trump, given the way Trump was disposed allegedly to conduct himself. Now, Zelensky didn't think he would get Tomahawks. But he was interested in keeping the Tomahawk conversation live. It's very important that Zelensky is engaged in a dance with the West, whereby they co-conspire to engage in a little bit of post-truth. I wouldn't even say post-truth necessarily. You could argue it's just deception. That's to say, the West the Americans or the Europeans say they're going to do something which they are clearly unlikely to do. And then Zelensky engages with that as though he believes they will do it, which he largely doesn't. Um, and so this very strange dance is taking place where both parties co-conspire to talk about Ukraine receiving support it is not likely to receive at all. That's some of what we're seeing. This is an extremely difficult balance for Zelensky to strike because he is essentially caught up in a dynamic of a proxy, and his proxy consists of two parties, broadly speaking, an American party that is essentially withdrawing from the conflict, and the European party that talks a much more proactive and coherent game than its actions back up. It's an incredibly difficult balance for him, and you could see his um, exasperation at the level of hard work he needs to do just to get through all of that stuff that he had to get through in the Trump meeting. Yevon asks, at the moment, what do you think about the most likely outcome of the midterms in the US? Republican Senate and Democratic House of Representatives. I'm not going to make predictions, but I will say that the Democrats are not understanding how existential the midterms are. The Democrats are also not understanding that you can't be passive and let Trump land self-immolate. You need to act. It's really a question of thinking of what's happening as a kind of disease of democracy, and you need to start treating it early. So what I would do is I would ring some alarm bells about the fact that this is an important historical moment, about the fact that you need real politics and not just moralization, and that you need the understanding that this is part of a longer pattern of democratic decline, which you can mitigate the earlier you intervene against it effectively. There's a piece by Tim Garton Ash. Tim is a lot more optimistic about the gloriousness of the West than I am. But he wrote a piece, something like 400 Days to Save US Democracy, about the midterms. It's a panoramic piece. It doesn't get into the nitty-gritty of US politics, but it conveys the spirit of the concerns I'm ventilating. I'm just going to drop it in the chat. Dane is asking for book recommendations beyond the Charles Taylor et al. Degenerations of Democracy. I'm going to skip for now because I want to do a separate video talking about this. It's very difficult because what is happening is, in a certain sense, about everything. It's very hard to get a book that captures it all. If I'm 20% healthier, I might write one, even though my focus is more on academic philosophy, if I can write anything at all. But I'm keen, possibly, to give that a go. The issue is that you're bringing together so many different things. I mean, you're talking about economic exclusion. You're talking about the crisis of men. You're talking about the regulation of social media. You're talking about various ideologies of self-realization, which don't square with solidarity and the public good. You're talking about recent history. We date the sharp slide down from about 2014 or so, but this was building from the early 70s in many ways. There is also a conversation about the failure of post-war liberalism, something that Samuel Moyn talks about quite a bit. So, I mean, you will never get a book that properly captures this. You may get a book that addresses it all with a helpful set of gestures toward everything that matters. I haven't seen it yet. So let me think about it more, but it'll probably be a recommendation of sort of 7-11 books that are all over the spectrum of this. Trash again. What are your thoughts on the Nordstream developments and the non-extradition of the chap from Poland to Germany? I bet this is a controversial topic. Well, the big line about this is simply that it's a public display of Western incoherence, of European incoherence, European incoherence about the rule of law, European incoherence about um, what constitutes an act of war and what doesn't. Um, so uh, it just makes the West look weak at even representing the kind of rules that it itself claims to follow. So it doesn't even matter what side you take on this. The political impact, either way, is European incoherence. Graham, do you sense a change for the better in most aspects of the war in Ukraine's favor recently, despite Trump? No. Um, there is one thing that is positive for Ukraine, the overwhelmingly positive thing for Ukraine, and that is that Putin this summer and in early autumn has again failed to make a significant advance. And that going for a year 4 is going to be even more politically and economically prohibitive for Putin, which, if you explain it properly, if you argue it out properly, does lead to the conclusion that it's not necessarily true that the longer you play the war out, that Ukraine would lose because all the structural factors are in favor of Russia. So that's one thing we can challenge. And it's an important thing to challenge because it shows us that you're not sending bad money after good when you support Ukraine. Having said this, Ukraine is doing worse on a range of measures. It's doing very well in terms of various kinds of military ingenuity, but it's doing very badly economically. It's doing very badly demographically, and it's doing badly politically. And this is going to be the most difficult winter for Ukraine. You're in an algorithmic bubble where you are likely to hear that Ukrainians are getting into a stronger position than the Russians. There's enormous algorithmic incentive for people who you listen to say that to you. There is also algorithmic incentive to say that Europe is really behind Ukraine now. I have heard that said in this algorithmic environment. That's an absurd thing to say, right? It's what it's not disinformation. It's just algorithm capture, if you like. No, the state of European support for Ukraine is woefully inadequate relative to Ukraine's critical needs. The US is withdrawing, and Ukraine is doing very well in terms of certain kinds of military ingenuity, and is doing very well in terms of um, holding the Russians to into an inability to make significant advances. But short of that, it's going to be the toughest winter of the war. It's going to be difficult. So I think you're too optimistic there. Obviously, we want you to be right, but I think that's too optimistic. Jan says, I adore the new intro to 2,500 years of democratic life. What's the name of the great musical trailer? Amalfitano, who is incredible, has just said what the name is. I keep forgetting. It's some kind of East European Jewish music from the 1920s or 1930s. Georgiev, how is Vlad's health? I need your support to help me get through this, to help me breathe. I was suffocating pretty badly for about 9 hours today, and now I am a bit stabler, but still struggling. So I need your support to help me get through, and you're giving it to me. How do you define neoliberalism? I mean, this is going to bore the bejesus out of everybody. I simply define neoliberalism as putting a magical primacy on the market. That's in contrast to making a strong case for the role of the market in a particular dimension. I think that if you are very pro market and you make transparent arguments for that, you're just very pro market, for better or worse. You're not a neoliberal. A neoliberal is somebody who somehow magically fetishizes the market, right? So for me, neoliberalism is not a position. There's lots of textbooks about neoliberalism. I don't share, I don't feel enthused about that usage of the term. I don't think you can define what neoliberalism is. It's a kind of magical thinking relation to the splendor of the market. What's next for Trump if you could reach no goal in Budapest? Trump has not developed the infrastructure that negotiations require. As we saw in the Middle East, negotiations are really tough. They require complex, collective, and multi-agent endeavor with many little chapters being put in place. Trump has none of that. He just thinks he has a personal relationship with Putin, and he thinks that he could solve the war very strongly, and is not able to so far, but he's going to try to do it very strongly again. So Trump has not put for himself in place the elementary professional background work that's required for serious negotiations. And he is losing this as he goes along, because Zelensky, in his visit, actually drifted further away from some of the concessions he was more rhetorically open to earlier, and Putin is drifting further away. So Trump is not bridging the two sides. If anything, they're drifting further away from one another and playing for time. So Trump is not making progress, but he doesn't have the space, he doesn't have the context to even make progress, because he has such an unprofessional relationship with negotiations. He doesn't know what negotiations are. Favorite must-see film by Werner Herzog? Um, The Land of Silence and Darkness from the 60s, and The Woodcarver Steiner, a stylized documentary about the ski jumper. Now I'm getting to catch up with us. Let me see you better. Budapest Cringe Fest or something comes out of it, I recommend you to think of the Cringe Fest as the default outcome. But international affairs are extremely unpredictable, and it's a very fluid world. Vlad, you often talk about, for lack of a better phrase, what the world looks like in Trump's eyes. What does developing that analysis look like? What tools, methods do you use? Alex is asking. Alex, I think that there are obviously some tools that you use depending on what your area of expertise is. Usually you're required to have very multidisciplinary tools. For instance, I've got here somewhere Marlène Laruelle's latest book on the ideology of Putinism, and Jeremy Morris just wrote a review of that book, which I recommended. And one of the problems why, one of the reasons why I'm a bit uneasy about this topic in general, is that the kind of professional skill set you need to analyze the politics of a particular country, and even that can take different forms. You can be a political scientist, you can be an ethnographer, you can be something else. These different skill sets are not the same as a skill set, you need to work out what ideology is, which, quite frankly, is a philosophical question. So the chances that somebody is going to be a philosopher and a Russia expert and then write a book about it, they're vanishingly small. So that creates a structural problem for all such debate. So very often you never have everybody with the right kind of, you never have a person with all the right kinds of vantage points. I mean, look at me. I'm actually not a country expert. I am not a regional expert. Um, Now, I happen to have such a depth of insight into Russian culture and politics that I basically probably defeat a lot of country experts, but I'm fundamentally not a country expert. That is just not my main expertise. Um, my main expertise is that roughly I'm a moral and political philosopher who then happens to know a lot about Russia. And I think that's a very useful constellation that a lot of you have benefited from here and on the main channel. But again, that is a particular constellation. Um, there are people with expertise on Russia on a dimension that is just not available to me because of my lack of professional activity, my lack of professional initiation. So it's always going to be a balance about which professional skills you bring. That's one kind of thing. And there's always going to be gain and loss in the way you bring these, you bring these skills, right? If Mark Galeotti and I talk about um, uh, the latest turn in the Russian political environment, and um, uh, Mark would have some very clear advantages over me because his relationship with Russia's political life is in many ways more professionalized than mine. But my relationship with broader concepts like authoritarianism and depoliticization is more professionalized than Mark's. And so that's going to be the dynamic. It's very important that um, you are going to have to do a little bit balancing on different plates, but that you also don't overtax yourself that way and start just BSing. Um, so that's the first thing, right? The presences and absences of different kinds of professional expertise. Then there is something very difficult, and that is what is the right way to talk about emotional intelligence and psychological reads you have on people. What's the right way to talk about that in public? And this is very, very difficult. So, for instance, I did a video, as you all know, on the main channel about Trump's narcissism. Well, that's a very difficult thing to talk about in public. I think we have a responsibility to do it, and I felt very well placed to do it. But I think that it's a difficult thing to talk about because people ask, what's the methodology there? How do we know that Trump has this challenge? Um, and the answer is uh, there is no way to know. If by way to know you mean some kind of empirical or factual proof, this is an interpretation. And the difference really is not that large between knowing what it means to make that interpretation and being able to make it successfully. So it's a question where the skill of doing something is virtually indistinguishable from understanding of what it means and what it's like to do it. And that creates a real problem because it means that the people who see the thing that there is to see it and see how one can see it, and the people who don't see it don't see it and don't see how one can see it. You know, and this comes in different forms. You can't ever know what's in the mind of another person. You can't ever say that there is some kind of structural problem in somebody's psychology. You can't ever say that somebody is neurodiverse by distance. You can't ever talk about somebody having ADHD or autism by distance. But how do you know? But how do you know? But how do you know? These are questions about emotional intelligence reads of psychological reality. And the trouble with them is that they're pretty circular. You can only appeal to superior expertise. Much the same happens in the evaluation of art or the evaluation of music, right? Beethoven's greatest piano sonata is uh, the Hammerklavier Sonata, Opus 106. Beethoven's second greatest piano sonata, right, is the Sonata Opus 111. But how do you know that's first and second? Why aren't they third or seventh? Why isn't 10 number 3 second? Why isn't the Appassionata first? But how do you know? But what I can't look at the score and give you some kind of empirical proof, right? It's an aesthetic judgment about how extraordinary the degree of originality of evolution of musical language, um, what Beethoven comes up with in a particular piece is, and what the emotional texture of it is, and so on. So these are inherently circular questions, and questions where you inherently are going to get blast back. But it's completely irresponsible for me not to go there at the same time, right? If I don't talk about what's wrong with Liz Truss, we're going to be left with the beautiful Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell going in circles, having not the faintest clue what's wrong with Liz Truss, um, while describing some of what's wrong with her without being able to name what exactly the problem is. Well, I'm sorry, but when we're talking about prime minister material, people who can start or stop nuclear wars, um, we need to absolutely be having a robust public discourse about if they have a narcissistic personality disorder, or if they have autism and have no idea they have autism, so they lack self-awareness about what's happening in their minds. Um, so all of that is absolutely vital. And when I talk about it, my main aim is actually not to just diagnose people and say, well, Trump's got a narcissism problem. It's actually to model what it might be like for a constructive discourse or debate about this in public to happen. That's actually my main aim. But it's very fragile and it's very difficult. So let's keep going. If Vlad ever sinks to the level of merch, a hello T-shirt is a must. I doubt I will, but um, uh, a few years ago, just as a joke, um, my partner made a Hello Beautiful Community sort of soft material bag, of which there's only one copy, which my sister now has. But that never became industrialized. Uh, these things don't make any money. They're just for fun. The people who really push them hard make like shockingly little money on them, unless it's an exceptional case. So it's not a way to support the channel in any way. But for funky fun, one time, if my health is stable enough, we could do it. We could do a small run of tote bags or something like that. Um, okay, let's see where we are. And then the other thing I would just add back to Alex's question is time, right? I mean, I have systematic notes in my Evernote app, the app I use for note taking, which is very useful for my disability because it converts voice notes into text very quickly. I have notes there on Putin from the 90s to today, right? So even though I am, in a way, a Russia amateur, I have almost a redonkulous level of contextual depth on Russia as a Russia amateur. Let's rock and roll a little bit more. Just scrolling up because I feel like I've missed quite a few. Thank you so much for bearing with me. UKDC says, "What's up with the Tomahawks? It looked plausible." Again, I just direct you back to my previous remarks. I think that even Zelensky thought it was unlikely. Pink Pearl. At the moment, I don't know what to think of Triggernometry YouTube, Konstantin Kisin and Francis. Is it algorithm drift, or does he really believe the point of views they share? Is this because of their backgrounds? So I am not regularly watching Triggernometry. In fact, I haven't seen any Triggernometry for quite a while. The only video I noticed just recently was they did one on autism with oh, for goodness sakes, Sacha Baron Cohen's brother, the autism expert. So I don't know. Konstantin is genuinely emotional and supportive about Ukraine, which is a bit unusual for him, perhaps in the algorithmic space he finds himself in. I would generally say, even when people drift, don't think they're not sincere, that they're most of the time going to be sincere. And then I just say, look, I'm doing very different things to what they are doing, so it's important to analyze these activities under different hats. I am something of YouTube, even though what I am is very broken professionally, but I'm something of YouTube. I'm a philosopher who then speaks in public. There's a difference between that and just speaking in public. Not saying one is more legitimate than the other, but structurally there is a difference there. I don't think about things to then say them on YouTube only. I think that's one significant difference. It's sort of like a it's going to sound pompous, but I'm probably like a winemaker whose winery is stalled for health reasons, talking about wine, rather than a wine expert who isn't a winemaker talking about wine. So that's one kind of direction of difference, which I'm not bringing out well, but we could bring out as we go on. Beyond that, I don't know what to say. I mean, obviously, I have very different views I recommend to Konstantin on Gaza. The only comment I made on the trigonometry content recently is that Konstantin said that the UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak wasn't English, and I said he was, and explained that in various ways. But again, that wasn't really a sort of indirect dialogue with the claims of trigonometry, because I gave much more of a philosophical account of how identity is constructed. So I didn't see my objection to what they said as even a participation in the same conversation, as it were. It was commentary from the side, where I said that ethnic Englishness and Englishness as a national identity are both categories we need, and that the category of ethnic Englishness plays a part in the category of English national identity, but it's only one part among others. Other parts being civic identification with England, being English or un-English psychologically. For example, I'm quite un-English psychologically, so I'm comfortable to talk about Britishness as something that applies to me, but probably not Englishness, because I'm much more at home in Western and Central Europe than I am in England in many ways, although London sort of crosses that to a degree. And then I think for all of the calamitousness of that concept in our culture, self-identification plays a role there. It's probably one of the 3 or 4 elements of Englishness, that if you genuinely have thought about whether you're English responsibly, and you've decided, yeah, I think I am, that plays a role too. Now, that doesn't settle it. We need to see how politically connected you are with England, and beyond just living here, how much do you think of of your civic ties to England? And then we need to think about psychologically where you're at with Englishness, and then we can say that the ethnic component is a big component for some people, less of a component for others. But putting that all together, obviously Rishi Sunak is English, and he even says he is English. So that's the analysis I gave. against Constantine's claim, which really was that he's not ethnically English and therefore he isn't English, which is not just a mistake, it's a misunderstanding, really, of the sort of textures of common usage around these concepts. Mr. Suit Gremlin says, I've watched Herzog's The White Diamond and it made me cry. Yes. What is the man's name? Graham Norrington or Graham Dorrington built his airship, and there's a chicken in the film. There's a very important role for a chicken in the film. Now, let's try to get political again. I'm scrolling down. You often critique the technocratic centrists for not providing clarity of vision for the future. Could you give me an example of the kind of clarity you are looking for? The central objection I have to technocratic centrism is procedural rather than substantive. And if you like, the procedural objection says that technocratic centrism is not substantive enough. But it's not an objection with particular substance. That's a separate conversation. What do I mean by this? The idea that you either literally outsource political decisions to experts, or that you act in a way that demonstrates that that's how you think of political decisions. That very way of going on is problematic in a low trust, highly divided society. So technocratic solutions are okay in a highly homogenized, high trust, stable society. We're going to work this out by saying, what do economic experts think about this? Or what do experts on what the National Health Service needs at the level of immigration think about this? Instead, what you need to do in a highly divided and low trust society, not as low trust and divided as the United States, but still quite a bit so, is you need to reckon with what different groups of citizens conflictively think on the doorstep. You can't just abstract away from that and make, if you like, a bureaucratically or expertise-wise appropriate decision. You need to much more center political sentiment on the doorstep by acknowledging it, by conceding to it, by developing debates between and within it. So technocratic centrism is depoliticizing. It tries to take, as the public intellectual John Gray likes to say, it likes to take politics out of decision making. And in a moment of a crisis of trust and deep divisiveness, we need to repoliticize more decisions. We can't say, well, our experts figured out what immigration policy should look like. A few citizens are irrational about it. Screw them. No, that way you're going to basically lose your democracy, and then there's going to be no room for any kind of constructive decision about anything. So technocratic centrism is just deeply inappropriate for our cultural moment, for our political moment. And the more we practice it, the more we damage ourselves and invite Trumps and Farages into power. One bit. Second bit, you need a clarity of vision around both policy. What are we going to do with immigration? What are we going to do with health? What are we going to do with defense? What are we going to do with inequality? But also, you need a vision of civic renewal. and it needs to be concrete. It can't any longer be the vague fabrication of Obama's 2008 campaign, which was very effective at the time. Hope and change and hope, change and hope, hope and change. Um, it was a masterly message from Obama in 2008. That's a catastrophe if you try it today. It's too vague. Um, it's too elusive. It's too much. Trust us on the disposition. We'll take care of the details. No, you need to openly hash out the details with the population, but fold the details into some kind of vision of civic renewal, which very strongly emphasizes patriotism. Um, so you begin to confiscate patriotism from the ex-conservatives, and something like solidarity of the public good. So that's the beginning of that conversation. Why do you think some people refuse to accept that Trump will never meaningfully change his position on Ukraine and Russia? I don't think Trump has a position on Ukraine or Russia. Trump wants a glistening trophy at the end, which says he's stopped a war. He doesn't have a clear position on what Ukraine wants and why. He doesn't have a clear position on why Putin is prosecuting the war. He has two personal relationships with Zelensky, who evokes aesthetic revulsion in Trump, and with Putin, who Trump idealizes. So that's about it. So he doesn't have a position. He has um, a sort of a balancing act between some structural reasons to regard Russia as a foe and considerable narcissism and ideology mediated pressures to align with Russia. And he's sort of floating in that balance, and that's where he's at. What would it require for him to, if you like, drop Putin as an object of narcissistic supply? It's virtually impossible. Because even if Trump turned much more on Putin, he'd still keep on fantasizing that they could reunite in the future. So much more likely even though it's unlikely, but much more likely is a change that's about Trump's narcissistic dependence on Putin being outweighed by Trump's narcissistic dependence on someone or something else. That's much more likely than Trump's narcissistic dependence on Putin simply fragmenting. It would fragment if Putin turned on Trump and started abusing him in public. Then he would just say, Putin is a nasty guy. Um, hello, Vlad. In if I remember correctly, you said in a previous live that you don't necessarily like Zelensky, that you might make a video about it. Well, I was thinking to make a video about why mm, mm, Zelensky stayed, about the heroism that he showed at the beginning of the war. I love Zelensky relative to the murderous tyrant in the Kremlin. But if I were Ukrainian, I wouldn't feel a natural disposition to trust him, and I wouldn't feel a natural disposition to, and I don't feel a natural disposition to be his friend. So I couldn't be close friends with Zelensky, for example. I could be close friends for all of my eviscerating criticism of Joe Biden. I could be close friends with Joe Biden. So that's really the kind of thing I'm talking about. I'm not talking about anything that politically significant. Zelensky is not not a profoundly empathetic person at the level of holding what others are going through. He's in many ways not grounded enough for me to talk about him having profound integrity and so on. These are just psychological observations. But I love Zelensky relative to the disaster that he is fighting against. Um, so that's just personal stuff. In terms of politically, well, most Ukrainians were very skeptical about Zelensky, and roughly they like him as a war leader, although still with a limit. Um, but they are increasingly concerned about him as a domestic politician. There is a tendency, without knowing anything about Zelensky, to idealize him, especially by folks like you who don't speak any Ukrainian or any Russian for that matter. Um, yeah, so I might speak about it more. I mean, I'm aware, vaguely of Zelensky's career before politics too, right? So I have that vantage point. So it's not anything. It's not anything sort of terrible about Zelensky. Um, you know, uh, and indeed, saying that you quite like a politician doesn't mean they're a good politician. I mean, I quite like my Prime Minister Keir Starmer, but I can't say that his government is going remotely well, or is heading in the right direction, or is doing the right kind of politics, and so on. But when I said that about Zelensky, I certainly didn't mean that he's in some spectacular and unknown to you way a fraud or corrupt. I wasn't saying any of that. So. Um, we might get to it. We might get to it because I would like to paint a picture of why he stayed. Because when he stayed, he grew enormously in a very short amount of time, in a very small number of days. Um, he went in many ways from a boy to a man very, very quickly. So there we go. And dropped some, but not all, of his um, passivity. For instance, passivity about who he puts in certain positions and so on. Um, uh, so that period of growth is absolutely fascinating because Zelensky is in many ways a very limited politician with very, very big flaws, but is also paradoxically at the same time one of the greatest leaders of the 21st century so far. I don't see how you could argue against that. So all of that is extremely interesting to discuss, and we will. Um, it's absolutely ridiculous online, right? Because what I've just said could be rendered as, oh, Vlad hates Zelensky. Um, And again, something that's very important in this conversation is, for goodness sake, give some agency to Ukrainians here. Figure out how they feel about Zelensky, right? Don't project your cartoonish stuff, from Vancouver while you're cozily sipping on your frappuccino. Um, Ukrainians are going through a lot. They have a very complex relationship with their politics. Try to figure out what they say. One of the weirdest things about the pro-Ukrainian space is how unserious it is about seriously, attending to what's happening in Ukraine, seriously listening to Ukrainians, seriously understanding um, what's happening in Ukrainian politics, Ukrainian economy, what is happening in the occupied territories, what kind of calamity the Russians are orchestrating there, and so on. There's a kind of a weird disbalance. I have talked about it earlier, whereby the most pro-Ukrainian people on the planet online still know 20 times more about Russia than they do about Ukraine. Samir says, I don't agree that the US is withdrawing. A lot of Republicans do support helping Ukraine continually. Have a look at statistics for Ukraine receiving military aid from the United States over the last year, and Ukraine receiving non-military aid from the United States. Just look at the stats and then come back to me. What do I actually think will happen at Budapest? We're going to talk about it, but as I say, Trump is structurally set up to fail pathetically at getting what he wants there because he doesn't even know how to negotiate professionally. Melissa, I think President Zelensky is a saint. It's beyond me how Zelensky maintains his composure and dignity while Trump spouts his nonsense. I think he showed saintly patience there. Yeah. In the absence of your ME, would you engage differently with the community beyond YouTube? Yes. In the absence of my ME, I would have a couple of philosophy books out there, and I would leverage those to get into my public intellectual role rather than the other way around. At the moment, I am developing as a baby public intellectual and hoping that if my health ever allows, that'll create some space to bring out some philosophical work that you might be interested in, funnily enough, because it will be about our culture. It will be about probably the political value of freedom. But that's the way I'm doing it. Also, I'd have a little team of paid people working for me. Um, whereas I haven't had any paid support at all, but I am getting incredible support from Amalfitana with Things YouTube. So it'll be much more professional in the sense that I would outsource the things that I'm rubbish at, like editing a video. Um, uh, so that's how it would look. Let me just check super chats for a moment. Microbase Studio, thank you, Godzooks. How many defective world leaders can be in power at the same time without things stumbling into chaos? So it's a chicken and egg question. We are increasingly, Lou, thank you so much. We're increasingly drifting toward a situation where the quality of our leaders is declining. Even when we've got relatively responsible politicians, let's take the example of my prime minister, Keir Starmer, who I'm extremely critical of, but I think he's a responsible actor. Keir is not a prime minister. I'm sorry, Keir is a cabinet minister in stature, in pedigree, in skill, in talent, in leadership. So we have, even when it comes to good political actors, a decline in quality. And that's very, very difficult to deal with because, quite frankly, I mean, I can't speak for myself because I am absolutely not a practical politician. I could never be a politician, even in an alternate life. But there are plenty of people who could be who aren't doing it because they don't want to, because it's a terrible job. It's like really jumping into a mountain of dung. So uh, we have that problem. We also have the problem that as trust declines, we are going to have destructive impulses liberated in our populations, which will in turn incline them to vote in destructive figures precisely because they are destructive. So the trend is negative, but there is always room for leadership. There's always room for great politicians to come through and make a difference. One video I'm planning on the main channel is what's the how do you define a politician who could be both successful and responsible in this age? What qualities would they need to have? What positions would they need to have? So we're going to do that. As Michael Ignatieff likes to say, but that's really like sort of squeezing something through the eye of a needle. It's a very fine space, very narrow space in which you can sort of, if you can at all, reconcile these things. Could independence movements, if successful, arrest democratic decline and revive democratic institutions? If you're talking about the United States, then uh, any kind of civil war dynamic that leads to secession already an indication of how badly things are going. Um, I tend to think that uh, secession movements, if you're generalizing about this, I know you're from Canada, secession movements are tendentiously more likely under these conditions because the further power is from you in a crisis of trust, the more you uh, distrust it. That's one of the problems the European Union faces. It's an ineliminable problem for the European Union. It's a place where, in the crisis of trust, power is too far from people. They want it brought back to their nations. So um, that might be a trend we can loosely generalize, but I'd be very skeptical about what happens after being somehow a sort of a positive uh, overcoming of the problems that were there before. I think that typically this would just reproduce the problems that were there before because the same social forces would apply. Wherever you are, if you secede, you're still going to have the social media problem we've got. You're still going to have the economic challenges we've got. Um, you're still going to have all the global social forces that undermine democracy in place. You could make the case you're going to have a smaller and more homogenous society, but obviously there's very few cases for where this is a live issue in the West. But tendentiously, no, I don't think this is a solution to the crisis of democracy for people for whom, in very rare cases, that's a live question. I don't have any thoughts about this talk of Elon and Trump doing a tunnel to Russia from Alaska. I have no idea about that. Um, Von Krul says, to some degree, I idealize Zelensky myself in the earlier weeks and months. I still don't feel Zelensky is a problem, even when he may fall short. Look, you don't need to idealize somebody whose side you take, broadly speaking. You're not 12 years old and you're not watching a Disney film, and politics isn't a Disney film. Um, Roughly what Ukrainians need to do is ask, is what Zelensky doing, in each case he does something, about Zelensky keeping power, or is what he is doing about securing greater sustenance for Ukraine's future, economically and politically? And that's the question that Ukrainians need to be asking. We're not Ukrainians, obviously. I'm not cynical. I'm not cynical. None of what I've said is remotely cynical. If anything, it's engaged and warm. I'm reading. I'm not frozen. I want a question function in this YouTube app, actually. Where is Russia today compared to the Soviet Union of the past? The Soviet Union was a hard left experiment in Western utopia. Russia is a somewhat fascistized, hard right authoritarian regime with a very strong element of what I call monarchism. So they're very, very different regimes. Um, Certain polities from the 1930s in Europe are closer to Russia um, today than the Soviet Union is. Don't mistake um, Putin's KGB past uh, for the erroneous thought that there's a huge amount of continuity there. There actually isn't. Do I think Zelensky is a good communicator? I think Zelensky is an extraordinary communicator and a shitty communicator at the same time. Um, it's both. Um, he has um, an incredible capacity to um, capture an historical moment, also to convey a very basic fact or a very basic truth in a way that you feel that the curtain to the soul is lifted. So he's a remarkable communicator. He's also a shitty communicator. Um, he is not a communicator who is a who is very good at realizing what the fears and worries and concerns of his audience are, um, uh, and then holding them, right? One of the examples is how much he under-communicated in the days running up to the full-scale invasion. Ukrainians were freaking out. What do we do? Is there going to be a big war? Is there not? What do I do? I buy a helmet? Do I move? Do I stay? Do I get food and water? How much? Um, what do I need to get some maps of where I live in case the internet goes? What do I do? Do I hide under the bed? Talk to me. There's like a giant army on my border. Talk to me. Yeah, it was anxiety-inducing under communication from Zelensky. Again, this is something you wouldn't know because you haven't followed Ukraine before the war. On the whole, um, so he's an extraordinary communicator and a limited communicator at the same time. The trouble that Zelensky has got at the moment is that he is genuinely facing a very, very difficult problem, and that's that he doesn't have a theory of victory. But he still talks as though he does. And so there's a post-truth element to the way Zelensky talks to Ukrainians at the moment, because he talks in slogans. He talks about concepts like, courage, resilience, and so on. But often these disguise an anxiety-inducing for Ukrainians absence of a picture of where the hell Zelensky thinks this is going and how the hell to get there. On the defending Zelensky side, he's in a bloody difficult position. What theory of victory can he have? He's in a very, very difficult position, and his solution is to sort of sticky tape over the dynamic as it develops with various kinds of sort of high pitch language, which actually was very powerful and worked really well in the first few months of the war. But to Ukrainians, it sounds tired now. To a lot of Ukrainians, it sounds tired now, and it sounds a bit kitsch and a bit sentimental and less convincing. But then put yourself in his position. I mean, there's hardly a more difficult political position in which to be in the world, because Zelensky has no way to pull out of a hat some kind of theory of victory. The realities around him just don't allow that. So it's really, really difficult, and it's a doomed if you do, doomed if you don't situation for Zelensky around his communication strategy. A lot of his communication strategy is almost like a kind of delaying tactic. I'll keep saying the same slogans over and over and over and hope something changes. Maybe the Putin regime will collapse. Maybe the Europeans will get their act together. So it's a very, very difficult position that he is in. And so whether you care or not about politics, you should extend enormous empathy to somebody balancing impossible things, which is what Zelensky is doing on a daily basis. And you can see how, um, you can see how taxing that is. I don't have a special comment about Trump and Venezuela for now. We might end up doing a chat about it. Broken bricks. Vlad, hello from Ukraine. I rarely comment here. Wanted to ask you a personal question. Do you ever feel nostalgic about your childhood in the Soviet Union? And do you enjoy coffee as much as wine? No, I don't enjoy coffee as much as wine. I haven't had a cup of coffee for several months because I can't because of my microvascular damage. Um, and I haven't drunk any wine for many, many months, but absurdly, preposterously, ridiculously, and that's obviously my friends tell me, "Oh, don't mention that in public because you'll sound like a weirdo." But I actually do taste wine from time to time without swallowing it because it's such a joy for me. It's such an incredible part of what absolutely thrills me, because wine is fundamentally about time travel. Um, it's about time travel in a way that nothing else is. You could be transported to a vintage of the past. Um, in a way that no other drink will do for you. Sorry, sorry to say, um, whiskey or Armagnac lovers, and there's no food that can do anything like what wine does. It's an absolutely extraordinary magical thing, but I can't put any into my body at the moment. So I sometimes taste without swallowing. Um, and my modest stash of wine I'm selling for health reasons, some of it. Um, so that's that. Nostalgia for the USSR. That's the video. That's the next video on my main channel. Why is there so much nostalgia for the Soviet Union? Um, I don't. I have, of course, a lot of Proustian memories of my childhood. I don't feel any nostalgia for the USSR. Largely, I think also because I don't identify very much as Russian, because psychologically, I mean, I left at 9, so I'm much more, like a German or a West European or a Brit psychologically, some South European in me too. I am sure there is an element of Russianness that structures my psychology, but it's subtle, it's generalized, and I feel extremely alien in Russian culture. I have a very deep understanding of it, but I feel very alien to the point that, I mean, I even you know struggle to express my personality in Russian. It just doesn't work. I sound like I'm some kind of chat GPT when I try to speak Russian. Even if I say something articulate, it doesn't sound like it's quite Vlad. Um, so that way, I don't feel any kind of cultural pull. Of course, I have a lot of childhood memories, and I have a deep sense of what were the sentiments, what were the feelings in the Soviet Union in the 80s. Um, so I think that's that. And of course, I have lots of visceral stuff that I remember, whether that be ice cream, whether it be other kinds of foods or snacks that I was addicted to, that kind of thing. And also, don't forget that in the 80s, um, folks on the whole in the Soviet Union idealized the West. And almost in a kind of utopian way that went too far. And as a child, that was my view too. My favorite thing to look at were German toy catalogs, and I leafed through them and I saw unbelievable. My toys were often sort of like quite heavy metallic things. I had a truck with soldiers that seemed to weigh a ton, maybe because it was made from remnants of metal from the military industrial complex. So I was um, overwhelmed by these toys, which were metaphysical to me in the German catalogs. Like children had toy cars they could get into. They had all kind. They had remote controlled car. Oh my god! But that wasn't about toys for me. It was about uh, a sort of delusory idealization of the West, not just as an amazing political and economic model, but as a place where human beings were happy, where human beings had no internal conflict between themselves or within the breast, within themselves. So it had a completely magical conception of the West. And at the playground when I was 6, my jokes were all, "Oh, imagine how funny it would be if, like, Russia, the Soviet Union had a war with Germany, conventional war. Germany would win like in one day." And of course, that wasn't even remotely true. But that's how disparaging my view was of the country in which I was growing up. And it's only later that I developed, a degree of sympathy for what Mr. Gorbachev was perhaps in a sort of tragic and unrealizable way trying to do. Um, but I am interested in the phenomena of Soviet nostalgia, and I'm going to talk about it because there is a lot of Soviet nostalgia still in the ex-Soviet countries among the older generations, and there's Soviet nostalgia in Russia. Now it's receded a bit because now increasingly, at least in polls, when people are asked, do you prefer the USSR? Do you prefer Russia's special path under Putin? More people tend to say Russia's special path under Putin. But that's about it. My first memory is when I just turned 3, and I'm walking on a mud track with my mother and father, and my mother drops a ring in a puddle and never finds it. And I remember thinking quite sort of um, coldly, I don't care about the ring, I just want to go home. I wasn't home, I was staying in a little room in a countryside house, I think. It was being rented. And that would be like summer 1984 when I'm 3. So that's when my memory starts really. And then I have continuous memory really from maybe 5, 6. Political memories are probably from sort of 7, 8 onwards, 87, 88. So I'm really meeting the Soviet Union in decline. I don't know that it's going to collapse, but I'm meeting it in decline as a kind of failed project that's gassing out. This would be a very different experience for people who were there earlier and maybe bought into some pious stuff in the 60s and 70s. Let's rock and roll more. I don't know if there was lead in my toys. I'm sure they were all right. I did have some cool toys. So there's a consumerist aspect to the nostalgia. I think that there's a consumerist aspect to most kinds of nostalgia in a hyper neoliberal society like ours. Sorry, I shouldn't use that term. I didn't mean hyper neoliberal. I meant very neoliberal. Hyper neoliberal means something else about the use of force. So yeah, sure. It's always these recollections are Proustian for me in a special way because it's all stuff that evaporated. Even these Soviet sweets and candies, they've all they've all either gone or they're not made um, as well now. So there's a sense of a certain kind of world that's receded. And I imagine that if you were Russian and living in Russia, you might get pulled into the idea that somehow there was still a way of um, making things good from within that world. Um, and as I'll argue on the main channel, I think what Soviet nostalgia fundamentally is a kind of somewhat consumerist, somewhat Proustian longing for a past vision of a future that was never realizable anyway. Do I remember Russian music? I have a vague sense of Russian music from the 80s and 90s, but that would be retrospective. Is life without wine worth living truly? Well, life without bad or average wine is very worth living. It's 99.9% of wine is best avoided and replaced by beer or tea or something else. But life without wines that have something to say is more impoverished. But as I say, that doesn't mean that I can magically just put some into my body. I can't. Well, we've gone off track, haven't we, beautiful community? Super thanks. Alex again, forgive the binary, but do you view politics or history as something of an inexorable churn of causes and effects, or do you view it as something that is capable of reaching a sort of stasis? Um, I don't know exactly what you mean, but I can begin to guess what you mean by churn. So I'm going to say a strong yes to that. I'm not sure what you mean by stasis. Um, Certainly, if you mean by stasis some kind of stabilization around certain political and economic um, conditions, then I would say no, there's going to be transformation. One thing that's certainly not going to be is a kind of a global convergence of a Fukuyamian kind. Another book recommendations request from Bronze. Uh, Korsler, I'm gonna get there, I promise. But it's, as I said, it's tricky at the same time. What's an acceptable red wine that a person can afford? Um, it completely depends on where you are. Um, there is a wine I've just selected for my um, wedding next year, um, but I'm not sure what that will even look like because I can't even stand, or I don't know what physical state I'll be in. Um, uh, and that's, funnily enough, a Blaufränkisch from a Polish producer called this. Um, Generally, if you're looking for budget wine, you want to look to the entry level wines from good producers. So I would look at, for reds, at Dolcettos or Nebbiolo. Um, uh, no, the wedding would be in the garden. I'll probably wear this. Um, uh, the you would look for entry level wines from great producers. So if you turn to Italy, you could look for Nebbiolo or Dolcetto entry level wines from producers like Vaira, Borlotto. Who else is relatively cheap? People are not cheap anymore. Um, well, anyway, there's that approach. Another approach is to go to Greece. Everybody tells you to go to Portugal or to Greece. But you've got to go to Greece. More for whites, but also for reds. A lot of budget Xinomavro wines from Greece are gonna overperform relative to just the notion of picking something blindly. It's always wonderful, I find, to find what wine is being made in your country, even that your country is not a wine country, and support that. Get to know it a little bit. It could be a little bit of a patriotic thing, and so on. So often recommend that. In France, obviously consider Beaujolais for entry level reds. Portugal is always recommended. I'd weirdly recommend you to stay away from Portugal, even though my sister's a wine professional. She lives in Portugal. Um, Annie, sorry about this. But because too many entry level Portuguese wines are conventional and over oaked, um, there's a lot of shit wine being made in Georgia, but I highly recommend Georgian wine as a category. Rachel has mentioned it. It's a good opportunity to drink some open, some orange wines at a cheap price. Even though the spiritual home now, I suppose, of orange wines is Friuli in Italy. Um, but you can get some cheap ones. You can get some cheap ones that way. When you're buying wine, pay attention that it's not heat damaged, because the wine's just going to be off if it's sat in a warm room for half an hour, for half a month. Um, so this is a problem with a lot of wine shops. They're selling you off wine. Wine doesn't survive at room temperature for a long time. And also pay attention to the viticulture. Is the viticulture decent? Or are you buying something doused with petrochemicals a la 1970s style? So don't do that. So understanding how the wine is made is almost more important than what the wine is and where it comes from. Now, that's about it on wine. Probably there's going to be a wine video on the philosophy channel about wine's role in our culture, but that's about it. Vlad, what are your thoughts on Gary Larson and his Far Side? I have very controversial views about Gary Larson and the Far Side, but luckily I can lean on the great Alfred Brendel to share these views. I have pretty much everything by Gary Larson. As you know, I like surrealist art. And I think Gary Larson is a genius. And I think that his work is really, really important. And I think the Far Side is a very important cultural item. So that's a controversial view. There's also Edward Gorey, and Edward Gorey is perhaps a better master with cultivating mood via the sketches. With Larson, it's the piecing together of the cartoon and the text. But there are some surrealist masterpieces there. So big Gary Larson fan. You see, what I've said about Gary Larson is also interesting. We are very rigid. And that's part of the reason why I actually love life so much. One of the things I love the most in life is recognizing that something is really good, even though it's not conventionally regarded as that, or it's not commonly recognized as that. It's just wonderful to do that. It's wonderful to do that. Rachel loves Edward Gorey. Me too. I have quite a big collection. So it's wonderful to not be stuck in the box, and you don't want to BS and say something that is trash is great, but it's wonderful to we've lost the picture, we've come back. It's wonderful to appreciate something as special or as beautiful, and be surprised by the fact that it is, even though conventional assumptions might lead you to the conclusion that it shouldn't be. Trash. Do you think Putin's Russia has an actual connection to pre-Soviet identity, or are they backward inventing? That's a really good question. In other words, I think you're asking how far is the Soviet Union a kind of cipher for the Putin regime on which almost anything can be projected. So Stalin is whatever you want him to be. Um, Personally, Putin was always skeptical about Stalin, but his language about Stalin over the years has become progressively more positive, and that's just political technology. He remains very, very triggered by Lenin because Lenin is a foreign agent. Lenin is a bit of a Navalny figure for Putin. Lenin is a foreign agent inserted by an enemy state into Russia to overturn the government. So Lenin is sort of Putin's ultimate nightmare. So the Putinist project, if you like, starts with the thought that the um, 1917 revolution was in fact a kind of partly foreign orchestrated legitimate coup. So that's interesting. Um, Obviously, it's also true that Putin is a fanatical neoliberal, and Russia is an extremely neoliberal society in which even the war is a certain kind of neoliberal enterprise. Citizens making contracts with the state without without feeling the state owes anything to them, or without feeling that they owe anything to the state, and with the feeling that nothing is off the table when as far as the business transaction is concerned, including their lives. Um, I'm told Jeremy Morris has written a piece about that that hasn't come out yet, but it'd be great to see it. So, on many, many dimensions, what we've got now in Russia is a kind of extraordinary deformation of the trends that began in the 1990s. But of course, there is still a Soviet legacy for all that I've just said about the differences between Russia today and the Soviet Union. But largely, the discourse around the Soviet legacy is, if you like, outside of cause and effect. The Soviet Union is now increasingly a cipher onto which things are being projected. And what's very interesting sometimes is the phenomena of the generational skip. That's to say, people who just missed the Soviet Union might not idealize it, but people who completely missed it by kind of a half a generation or a generation then begin to idealize it, partly facilitated by their extreme distance from any realistic sense of what it was like. Europe has a GDP greater, Jason is saying, than America. Why does Europe depend on the USA for protecting them rather than being able to defend themselves? Because Europe is not a single bloc. It is a constellation of very different kinds of countries with very different kinds of politics, very different kinds of cultures, who are all experiencing political crisis at home. And the things that are holding Europe together are more like untethering rather than retethering. And because Europe's facing a very difficult problem, because rearming will undermine its democracies. But not rearming will undermine its security. Do you think the US's weak stance on Ukraine will make it more likely for China to invade Taiwan soon? I'd remove the soon, um, but broadly speaking, I'd say yes. And what we allowed Israel to do in Gaza also creates more of a yes for the question of China and Taiwan, unfortunately. Echelon saying, I love this talk about wine. It comforts me with an area where I'm utterly epistemically lost and can't even begin to connect to anything tangible. Very surreal. It's very surreal. What I invite you to do is not to get triggered by wine. A lot of people get very triggered by wine because there is a lot of myths out there that um, uh, sort of the very idea of amazingly interesting wine, moving wine, is a fraud, and it all tastes the same. And so wine inspires a great deal of insecurity in people, because they don't know much about it. They can't bear the fact that there's something that could be terribly interesting that's missing that from their lives, which isn't a problematic thing. Most things that are interesting are missing from our lives because we're just finite human beings who can only combine so much into a single life. But there's a tendency, especially in the UK, to say, "Well, no, 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 it's just elitist nonsense to say that there's great wine." And the answer to that is, well, don't criticize anything until you know what it's like to love it. So consider that with music, consider that with art, consider that with quite a few things. Don't criticize something until you've grasped what it's like to love it. Once you've grasped that, then you can criticize it by pointing out, for instance, well, you do love it, but it's not something that can generate a deep level of love and so on. And then I'm going to be critical of it because that thing can be a thing that's loved more deeply. It's more interesting, blah, blah, blah. That's fine. But don't just, sort of ride roughshod over something before you understand why people love it. Um, so that's it. But again, it's not something that people need to have as part of their lives. It's one of 77 different things that are out there. You only get to pick two or three. Um, Also, unfortunately, and this will be a chat, um, the greatest wines in the world are not accessible to people like us unless they're sort of given to us via networking or connections. Virtually nobody in this chat, none of us can buy the world's greatest wines anymore, which is a tragedy because for people getting into wine, it's a bit like getting into, I don't want to make the comparison, music is much superior to wine, but um, it's like getting into classical music, but only being able to listen to compositions that Mozart composed under the age of 12. The compositions that he composed from the age of 18 and 21 onwards. Mozart really came of age at the age of 21, by the way. A lot of the stories in our culture about how he was the greatest child and teenage genius are not true. But imagine that if only really rich people could listen to Mozart compositions after the age of 21. That's a little bit like the reality we've got with wine. So it's very difficult. Um, because it even means that most wine professionals don't get a sense of what it is that is what are the peaks, the aesthetic peaks of the world that they are in. Um, some countries try to solve this. Canada, Scandinavian countries, by doing a lottery for fine wines, a controlled lottery for fine wines, but that has disadvantages too, and it still means only a tiny number of people get access. And okay, Vlad, shut up about wines. This is not a wine podcast. For goodness sake. For goodness sake, Vlad. Let's do 5, 10 more minutes and then we're good. Um, okay, Rachel, you can't do that. You can't do wine comments because I'm going to react to them. So one of the weirdest things about wine, when I could drink it before, is that you don't want to get drunk on it. Because if you have a deep relationship with wine, the last thing you want to do is be drunk. You want to be sober. Otherwise, it's not enjoyable. Anyway, Vlad, please stop talking about wine for goodness sake. It's unbelievable, unbelievable. If I were less sick, I would have a wine channel where I rave on about wine, maybe about the more philosophical dimensions of wine, sort of judgments of quality, wine's place in culture. But I'm not well enough to do that, I don't think, unless I just lose my mind. What happened to Vexley? Is he doing any political? No, He just talks about Pinot Noir now on YouTube. He's lost it completely. From bed, he can't even drink it. He just talks about it. I mean, he's a complete and utter lost cause. Total lost cause. Ivan Ivan Klashov saying, "Sending you love from Ukraine. Thank you for helping me make sense from this crazy chaos around us." We have a tiny percentage of Ukrainian viewers, more Ukrainian than Russian, quite a bit more, and I'm very grateful. Very grateful to have you. Especially grateful for your patience, because I'm primarily addressing a Western audience, so it kind of can sound like I'm speaking past you. So I'm grateful for the patience to stay with me. No, you can't get to cheese, Nicholas. You can't. I have strong cheese opinions about wines. I have opinions about how basically you can't pair wine and cheese. Controversial opinions. The cheese doesn't go with wine, with very few exceptions, like Comte and Vangeon from the Jura. That's about it. Um, so I have very controversial views about this. I don't need to be pushed into ventilating them because I have no self-control. When you ask me about wine, I can't shut up. So don't encourage me to misbehave. I have so many extreme claims about wine pairings. I cannot go on this tangent. So okay, Vlad, stop. Stop. Okay. Right. Unbelievable. And yes, I do have a whole section on wine food pairings in my Evernote dating back years. But funnily enough, I'm somebody who doesn't love pairing wine and food. I think wine should go by itself. Um, on the whole, that's itself a controversial opinion. But if a wine is very distinctive, I don't want to pair it with food. Um, but again, I'm talking absurdities now because I can't drink wine right now, or maybe forever. If it's forever, then I'll be okay with that. It's life. I can't. I can't. The total and utter collapse of impulse control. Okay, let's get back to politics for just 5 minutes, and then we'll say goodbye. I cannot believe that I lost the plot like that. Cake is better. I can talk about cake without losing impulse control. Carrot cake, homemade carrot cake is my favorite. You might be, Jan, you might be able to get a uh, 10 wine pairings for Christmas video just as a joke. But like if I do it, the content would be, this is the paradox. Like if I did wine content, it would be incredible. But I just can't justify it in this life. I love tiramisu. I love tiramisu. Tiramisu is one of my favorite desserts. I'm following the No Kings, Alex. I'm following the No Kings demonstrations in America. I don't have any special comment at the moment. Politics or cheese? Politics by far. I'm actually not big on cheese at all. Um, I I uh, I would only be open to cheese if, first of all, there's some health restrictions there for me, but only when it's amazing. I have no interest in eating quite good cheese, which is why the last time I had cheese was probably, could be a couple of years back even. Unbelievable. Somebody had tiramisu last night. Bombi saying, I'm here together. I'm here because I love you after all of these years together. Rachel, whose birthday? Rachel, is it your birthday? Rachel, what are you doing on your birthday? Um, Happy birthday, and wishing you. What do I wish you, Rachel? Just wishing you to feel freer and more you um, in the next year of your existence, and for you to have some magical moments, whether you experience them now of your birthday or during the course of the year. So, sending a big birthday hug. Where does Zelensky rank in terms of greatness of war leaders? Not that high historically, but very high in our contemporary period. I mean, he's one of the greatest political leaders of this century. Easy, easy. But that does not mean that he's a saint. You have to idealize him. Right? Right? Thank you for saying happy birthday to Rachel, everybody. Being Lisa. Vlad saying build on your strengths has been amazing for me. You know, I'm a big extremist in that sense, because I think extremism is practical. So, you know, if you're very, very good at this, um, uh, and so at that, I'd much rather you try to become even better at this rather than bring yourself up from low to average on the thing you're less good at. Now, there are some professional circumstances where it's not true, where you do need to bring up a weakness just to make things work. But on the whole, 9 times out of 10, humans are just happier personally and professionally when they go in on their strengths rather than trying to improve their weaknesses. And I'm myself perhaps a sort of really wonky example of an extremist like that, right? I'm just terrible at most things. I'm not a very even person. I'm unbelievably ignorant about so many things, and I'm unbelievably incompetent at so many things. I mean, for example, I'm profoundly incompetent at maths. Um, I also think that human beings learn better when they um, try to make progress around what already motivates them. Um, you know, um, so that's very important. That the thing that's going to move you is the thing that already moves you. Um, and so a lot of change that humans try to make is change that's about the idea, erroneous idea, that you can sort of talk your way into having something in your motivational set that isn't there. And I'm like that. I am intensely interested in the things that I'm interested in, and almost like comically uninterested in the things I'm uninterested in. I'm constantly teased about this because I know so little about, um, you know, so many things. I'm probably below average middle class knowledge on certain things. For instance, I'm completely uninterested in the rules of grammar. I used to be completely uninterested in um, flowers. Now I'm a bit more interested, but I knew like nothing about them, less than an 8-year-old would know. So I have these absolutely blank spots because I'm such an extremist. Okay, I've seemed to have just been ranting. And then Alex is making a useful point, also introducing the notion of talent there. Of course, you have to be objective about what you're talented at, especially if you're a person of the younger generation. Now we skew older here, but there are some young people with us. And so it's very important to go in not just on what interests you, but also on your talents and your strengths. because I don't believe that talents are mostly made. They're mostly things that you make a lot of, having been born with something. Does Trump believe his own lies? Let's just end with that. Um, so um, I don't think Trump lies as such because he's so much a post-truth communicator. So let me qualify that. Of course, Trump lies a lot, but most of his deceptive statements are not lies, they are non committal post truths. So um, I don't give a hoot whether the sky is blue or green. I'll just say it's green today, I'll say it's blue tomorrow. I don't care, though, to check what it really is. Screw that. And if it serves me, I'll just keep saying that it's blue, and that's all I'll bother with. So there's a kind of a pre-belief level of dispositional fluidity in Trump, whereby most of his untruthful statements aren't lies. Leaving my townalization Gewürz needs quite a bit of age, and it does need to come from a good producer because a lot of these wines can feel a little bit too unclean. But it's a Boxler, Humbrecht, it's all good. Right, lad, shut up. Um, was there a NATO question there after the Trump question? Hi, Vlad. Surely, if Putin is to attack Europe, NATO, like many geopolitics predict, would it not be logical for him to attack sooner before Europe can rearm? Um, Again, let's be clear. I don't think anybody serious is talking about a full-scale war between Russia and NATO. Obviously, that's something Putin would like to avoid, not create. However, he is capable of a low threshold challenge to Article 5. And I'd go quite far about what he can do. And I'd be quite skeptical about what the Western response would be. I think that Putin's view would be no, because Europe's weakness comes not so much from its incapacity to rearm or capacity to rearm, but from its political decline. And so European democracies will be weaker 5 years from now than they are today. And that's a more advantageous historical moment for Putin to push further. So I would say that it's somewhat optimistic to think we're going to be more protected from Putin in 5 years because we rearm. Um, we'll be more protected in some respects if we do indeed rearm constructively, but we'll still be less protected overall because fundamentally we're not protecting ourselves from some kind of full-scale war with Russia. What we're protecting ourselves against is some kind of um, Article 5 triggering misdemeanor um, in, for instance, in the Baltics. Right. I think we're good. We've lost all impulse control. We've stopped talking about politics. Okay, very last question. Rax Sad, how likely is it Russia is going to try to invade the Baltics in the next decade? If you're talking about a full-scale war um, against NATO, close to zero. Um, what are the chances that Russia is going to invade the Baltics in the next decade in the sense of launch a couple of rockets which might not hit their target at something in the Baltics or even at some NATO troops in the Baltics from other countries, um, uh, or do something that will put NATO to a decision about whether it's been attacked or not. Um, Publicly, I'd say 50-50 because we're friends here. I'll say 30 to 40% chance. Um, so very, very real. That he will do something that is supposed to trigger Article 5 but won't. And don't forget, Article 5 is itself a sort of a murky thing, but something that's supposed to trigger Article 5 but doesn't, and in virtue of us doing nothing, that'll further undermine our alliance strength and our democracies at home. So it'll be a political action much more than a military action, if you like. Echelon, good night. So, Anthony, good night. Thank you. So, I think that's what I would say. So, the chance that he'll do something nasty in the Baltics are, let us say, it would be responsible to say 50-50 because when you don't know, you just say 50-50. I'm going to say 1 in 3, cartoonishly. But that's not an historical prediction. That's about how I recommend we set our historical expectation. That's all I'm saying. It's not a real prediction. So there's plenty of literature about how well the Baltics are prepared for this. But I think often a lot of these bits of writing about how well the Baltics are prepared over militarize the enterprise that Putin wants to engage in and under politicize his actual aspirations. Enough. Lots of love. Talk soon. Thank you for 800 of you and now 650 of you surviving 1 hour, 50 minutes with me. Lots and lots of love and bye-bye till soon.